know. Is this better if I'm up here? Can you guys see it better? Okay. Hi, everybody. So thank you so much for being here tonight. I know it's hard to come out, Tuesday evenings. It's dark. I still hate the time change, but here we are. So my name is Natalie Talpesh. I am a school counselor right now, but I'm also a licensed clinical social worker. I work for Sheridan House part-time. So I've done my fair share of counseling. I am married to Danny Talpesh. Some people know him in the community. He's a middle school assistant principal at Calvary Christian Academy, and we have two girls. They're 10 and 7. So we're right in the thick of it with you. Parenting is challenging. It has its own things that we have to come alongside and deal with. But my hope tonight is not necessarily to fix you, because that's a really tall order, or fix your children, but to give you some information that hopefully you can take back, some strategies you can implement, at home with your children, and just kind of have maybe a better understanding of how to help them, because we know it's challenging to be a parent. So first I'm going to kind of define mental health, okay? So mental health, because it's so many these buzzwords, we hear all the time. So it's kind of our overall emotional, psychological, social well-being. It includes how we think, what we're thinking, how we feel, and then that impacts how we act. Stress is being overwhelmed to the point where you maybe have difficulty coping with the stress, and it's how you're impacted, right? So we can have chronic stress, and chronic stress can lead to mental health concerns or issues, right? But when we're diagnosing, so this is really important, because sometimes these kids come to me and they're like, I saw on TikTok, that if you do these 10 things, I might have anxiety. Do you think I have anxiety? Right? So they have all these thoughts of what they think that looks like. And I'm always like, don't go to TikTok or Instagram or WebMD, right? Like, you have to go to a professional to get diagnosed with these things. And we're looking for something that's persistent, that's lasted for 6 months or longer, that's impacting and impairing their ability in 2 areas of their life. So school and home, typically for a student or a child, right? And our mental health fluctuates day by day, right? So you may start the day off really well, and then you get some bad news in the afternoon, and then you're not feeling so great, right? So we know that those fluctuations are normal, and you're gonna see that in your child, your teen, right? That's very, very normal. And if you're concerned about your mental health, we're like, go to a professional, go to a doctor, go to a licensed, mental health counselor, someone that really knows what they're doing. So that's really important to me. Now, anxiety is more, it could be generalized. It could be that you're just a lot of worrying, persistent. We see this in small children. Sometimes they are very anxious to go to school, and it doesn't present as them saying, hey, I'm worried and I feel anxious. It presents as in, I have a headache, my stomach hurts, I don't feel good. And the same can be true for teenagers. Now, prolonged anxiety can lead to depression. And depression, we see like the commercials, right? Or like how TV portrays it, where they're withdrawn. They don't want to get up. There's loss of hope. They don't see themselves and situations maybe accurately. There's the misperception, almost like that cloud just kind of over our minds, and we don't see things for what they really are. So in the next slide, I went to a Learning in the Brain conference in Boston, and they had some of the best minds in the world in education and psychologists, and this guy named Dr. John Gabrelli, he's from MIT, and they had done some stats post-COVID, and they said, we're seeing all these alarming statistics, right? So we're seeing a 50% increase in depression in adolescents and young adults, 100% increase in pediatric anxiety. So it's double, right? Double the increase in ER visits with suicide ideation or attempts, and 1 in 3 female, high school students said they felt sad or hopeless. That's alarming, right? So we're like, what is going on here? Now, of course, there's lots of theories as to what that would be, and I'm going to go into that in a minute. But just looking at these stats, I could tell you last year as a school counselor, I had about 5 girls that withdrew because of mental health issues. So it was real, like we're seeing it on the field. We know it's happening. Question is why, and what do we do about it, right? What do we parents do? So symptoms I want to just, you to be aware of. So when you're kind of looking at your kids, looking at the family that you love and all these people around you, these are what you're looking for. You're looking for irritability and anger. So you're really that is depression, kind of masked, right? Anger is like secondary emotion. Everything just makes this person upset. Now, teens do have mood swings, so that alone would not be an indicator, right? But we're looking at a conjunction of things. Changes in behavior, so that once outgoing, bubbly kid who was involved in all the things that wanted to go out now just wants to be in their room. They don't want to be bothered. They're disengaging. Now we're seeing a little bit more of a concern. Trouble sleeping. That could be sleeping too much or too little, or just having a hard time, being restless trying to sleep. I had one girl who told me, she's like, I can't fall asleep with anything. You give me melatonin, you give me chamomile tea, you give me hot milk, it doesn't matter. I don't fall asleep. That was really hard for her. And then of course, you're not sleeping, that also doesn't make you feel good, right? So it's this vicious cycle. Neglecting responsibilities. So, dropping the ball, not turning in assignments, not doing their work, not doing their chores. That can also be, and just as a sidebar, a child maybe with a learning need that's maybe missed or undiagnosed. Maybe it's really hard for them to keep up with the work. And that's also causing some angst, some depression, some anxiety, because they can't keep up and they feel like a failure. So that could also be a sign of a learning need. And I throw that out there because that's kind of dear to my heart, because I've seen a lot of students have that happen, where anxiety or mental health stuff is kind of a secondary symptom to them not being able to keep up in the classroom. Eating changes, so again, eating too much or eating too little, getting sick more often, all those physical ailments that you might see, and then of course severe concerns being self-harm and suicidal ideation. I thought about self-harm, sometimes people think that self-harm is suicidal ideation. It's not. So self-harm is their ability, they're trying to have the feeling come back. They're feeling numb, they're feeling disconnected from their body. It's to actually make them feel alive again. So a lot of times they're not doing to end their life, although it could result in that, but it's not really for that, but it is more of their way of coping, not a healthy way to cope, not something we want them to do. We definitely want them to get help if you're seeing that at home. And I want to talk a little bit about the brain. So our executive functions are kind of housed in this frontal lobe of the brain. Any doctors in here or medical professionals that know about this? So right here is where we have our working memory, our reasoning skills, flexibility when things go wrong and we have to have a new plan, executing that plan, problem solving, and emotional regulation, okay? All of this part of the brain does not develop fully till about the age of 25. So when we expect young children, when we expect teens to kind of reach this point where we are, they're just not there yet. And we have to kind of remember that. Now, it's not to get them off the hook. We're still going to hold some boundaries. We're still going to hold them accountable. But we want to know that we're dealing with a brain that's not fully developed. It's not there. And back to that student that might have that learning issue, they're also a third behind their peers in development of that frontal lobe. So that's another really important fact to kind of think about. So then what happens when our brain is overwhelmed and our brain is just, we have something happen to us and something just really makes us really, really upset. So that back of your brain has the amygdala. I love that word. I think that's going to be my next dog's name. So the amygdala is where we sense fear. Now, this is great, right? This keeps us alive. It keeps us safe. We know things are dangerous, and it really keeps us from doing the wrong thing. But that's where you've heard of that flight or fight, response happens, right? When we are faced with something scary, we're either going to fight it or we're going to get the heck out of there. So this is what happens when our brains are, what we like to use the word flooded. So we're child's overwhelmed, they didn't do well on something at school, their friend made them upset, you made them upset, and they're all of a sudden just having a meltdown. And they're just unreasonable. You can't reason with them, right? When they're in this state. You can't reason with us when we're in this state. So the blood kind of goes back to that amygdala part, all the way left the frontal lobe. When you tell someone, hey, calm down, and that doesn't work, right? So it doesn't work. So the only way to change that response, the only way is to change what the five senses are taking in. So that would be what? Music. That would be some tasting. That would be getting some that's why we say go get some fresh air. Take a walk. Move your body, because you want that adrenaline that's kind of spilling through that body to move out, because you're not going to be able to reason with a child or even yourself. And that's why sometimes we need a break, right? When we're getting a little escalated or upset. We need to walk away for a minute. And that's part of that process. So we got to know that we're dealing with biology here when a kid is truly having some reaction and emotional dysregulation, okay? So back to like what's threatening our mental health, right? So what's causing all this? Why are these kids, the snowflake generation, we're calling it, right? What is that? Why is this happening? A couple things, parenting style, and I'm careful here because, we know the old generation and, our great-grandparents was like, figure it out, suck it up, move on, you don't need to cry about every little thing, get over it, right? And they did that kind of thing. And then you had the pendulum swung, and then you have parents that are like, oh, I never want my kid to get upset, and I don't want them to have any problem, I'm gonna make sure I take care of it, and we catered a lot to these kids, right? I was at the store the other day, and my daughter was asking me for something. She's like, oh, can I have this? Can I have that? And this man kept turning around kind of looking at us, and finally he turned around and he said, how did you do that? And I said, I'm sorry? And he's like, well, you told her no, and she didn't cry. And I said, yeah. I go, well, she has to know that the word sometimes no is okay. I said, he goes, oh, my kids cry when I say no in the store. I said, how old are your kids? He's like, oh, they're like 8 and 6. I said, okay, that's normal, but you can start letting them cry and just be there with them in that moment. Say, I know it's hard to not get what you want. It's really hard for me when I don't get what I want, but the answer is still no, right? So there's like this whole thing of like, how do we maintain space for our kids to have emotional reactions, because they're going to, or we're going to, hold the line, hold that boundary, but also in a very loving way. And it's finding that balance. And that kind of term that was authoritative parenting, that's kind of that style that we want to look for. It got rebranded as to gentle parenting, which also took a whole nother spin. Sometimes things get rebranded. Also, lack of self-care. So I would say that teens spend a lot of time on their devices, right? On their computers, which they do need, and that's part of the world that we live in, we know that. And then sometimes they are threatened, there's lack of sleep, they don't get sleep. Then they're, not eating properly, right? They want junk food, we know, that's part of it too. And then just not taking basic self-care. So I think that's something I'm going to talk to them about making sure that they're practicing good sleep habits. Are they taking care of themselves? Are they getting some sunlight? We need some sunlight. We're like plants a little bit. And then information. Sometimes we get the wrong information, right? From the internet. We definitely get the wrong information. And then our pastor this weekend, so if you go to Calvary, he said something good, and I said, oh, I'm going to add that, I like that. He said, sometimes we get our information from few, friends, enemies, and the world. And that's not where we're supposed to be getting our information from. We're supposed to be getting it from God's word. And I'm like, that's 100% right. So these kids do that. They go to their friends for information. They go to the internet for information instead of God's word. And then, of course, technology and social media. So in my personal opinion, I think one of the reasons we're seeing such a big jump in mental health issues really is the social media factor that our kids face. We know that every time they get an alert on their phone, anytime they get a Snapchat, anytime they get a ding or a like, the brain gets a shot of dopamine. It reacts the same way as a drug addict getting their fix. So it has a very similar reaction. So imagine if this is what they're used to. They're used to this high level coming in all the time. And then we want them to sit here for, a while and focus and, concentrate on something. And their brains are like, what is this? We're not used to this. So I think that's a big part of it. Raise your hand if you have seen Social Dilemma on Netflix. Fabulous. Okay, so you kind of already have that context. I rewatched this. It's been a while, and I wanted to show you this clip because I thought it was fabulous and it was a good reminder. So we're going to just play that clip now. Thank you.
They can't stop looking at social media.
Their brains.
They become addicted.
And there's something very dangerous about that.
The number one problem, the number one psychiatric disorder among teenagers is anxiety. Typically, it's anxiety about needing to check in with social media.
There's another study that looked at fear of missing out, and it looked at kids who have high anxiety around missing out. Even though social media makes them more anxious, makes them more worried about missing out, they can't stop looking at it. That prefrontal cortex hasn't developed enough for them to be able to put it down, to say to themselves, it's not making me feel good.
The prefrontal cortex, this area of the brain that is involved in our cognitive control, our ability to process and direct our attention based on our goals, is the last part of our brain to develop.
This doesn't get completely myelinated until you're in your mid to late 20s.
So kids are getting these tools right when they have the least capability of actually controlling their behavior.
I think we can confidently say that it's changing the way that teens interact with each other, with peers, with the world, and that those changes in interactions lead to sort of changes in behaviors, changes in psychiatric and sort of mental health.
We should not be surprised. And it's not just because the culture changed, it's because their brains have changed.
They also get trained in instant gratification by these devices. And there's something very dangerous about that, because in real life, we don't get everything that we want instantly.
They are bombarding our teenagers and our young adults with so much that they become addicted to the continuous input of stimulus and information.
We know that there are many activities that are critical for our development. Face-to-face communication, physical activities, exposure to nature, and sleep. I would say that all of these are being threatened in some way by increasing access to information technology.
I think parents are in a really tough situation right now. I think because this tech has negative effects, they have to balance between trying to protect their kids, but also, let's face it, there's tremendous social pressure to use technology. And it's also incredibly important that children are technically literate. And I think there need to be more resources that help them make those decisions. And frankly, the companies need to be partially responsible, largely responsible, for ensuring that the use of these products is responsible.
What'd you think? Thumbs up if you thought that's probably spot on. Yeah. So, triggers, and, this word is so politicized, right, in our society. Triggered, everything, kids are triggered, everyone's triggered, right, about something. But, psychologists use this word, to indicate something that brought someone back to a traumatic experience. That's what this word actually means, right? And this is what puts that brain in that flooded response. So, and if something were to traumatic in here, like somebody were to walk in with a gun and we were all facing some trauma, a third of us would walk out traumatized. The rest of us would actually be okay. So the trauma is not the thing itself, it's how we perceive it. It's how the brain perceives it. And I know some of you are going, that's crazy. I think we'd all be traumatized, right? But it's true that trauma is very individualized. So something that you might think to someone else is not traumatic, it is to that person. So, we all have these triggers, these things that put us on edge, these things that make our brain flooded and overwhelmed. Exhaustion, that's a big one for me. I know when I don't get my sleep, I'm on edge, right? Overstimulated, overscheduled. This leads to being unfocused. This leads to being, unmotivated, kind of lost, right? And all these other things like overeating or overanalyzing stuff. And I just want to ask you guys, what are you seeing in your teens? Is there something that you're seeing that kind of just sets them off and upsets them? Anyone want to be brief? Yeah. Feeling overstimulated. Yeah, just too much going on. The senses are overwhelmed. What else? Anybody else seeing stuff like that? I know for my daughter, my oldest, definitely overscheduled. When we have a lot going on and it's like been a marathon week, by the end of the week, I usually am expecting tears because she's just done. She's just over it. And I kind of get it because I feel like that, but I'm an adult, so I have better emotional regulation, right, than she does. So these are just some things to think about. But then now what do? How do you help them? So number one is stay calm. Stay as calm as you can. We want to model emotional regulation for our kids. So when you're in the car and someone cuts you off and you're like, oh, that person, blah, 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 what did you just model for them? When something goes wrong at home, do you also, oh, the glass broke. Okay, it's a problem. It's an accident. We can clean it up. Or do you jump and get really, really agitated and upset? I read somewhere and it was like, oh, the path to enlightenment, I know we don't use those words, but is to have children, because then you see all the things about you that are really magnified, right? And things that bother us, and all of our parent voices, from our childhood coming back. So it really, really takes a space. So when your kids are maybe telling you, I'm upset about this, and I know what the trigger is for me, and I'm sure this is true for a lot of you, I want to fix it, or I want to say, oh, my goodness, you have life so wonderful, don't you? You have a great life, you have a roof over your head, you got all these friends, but for them, whatever they're upset about, it's important to them. And we have to put ourselves into that teenage space of what used to upset us as teenagers. We gotta go to that place. So that's my next point, which is empathy, right? So don't dismiss it, because I know we want to, because we're kind of annoyed and we're like, okay, they're complaining again, because teenagers do that too. They're complaining again. We want to empathize, okay, and ask questions. Tell me more about that. What does that feel like for you? And then kind of ask them what the solution is. Well, what do you think you could do about that? And how can I help you? Is there something I can do? What do you need right now in this moment for that? Ask questions, get curious about where this is coming from. So I know that takes a lot of patience, and I know sometimes we don't have a lot of time to do that too, but that is definitely something we want to practice with our kids, because they have the answers and they know what to do. They might just need you to be there alongside with them. Remember I talked about the brain just going flooded? We want to engage those senses. So if they're really escalated, you want to kind of do something different. You want to throw some music on. You want to give them something to eat. You want to do we can give them some water. You want to, hey, let's go for a walk outside. I think the dog needs to go for a walk. Here's the ball. We had, so one of our teachers at Calvary has a therapy dog, and she was explaining there was a little girl who didn't want to go into class. And the little girl was just shut down, didn't want to go to class. And so the dog came over, and now she started to get a little more curious and a little excited. So after a few minutes of talking to the dog, she said, oh, who's your friend in your class? She said, oh, so-and-so. She goes, do you think so-and-so would want to meet the dog? She perked right up. Okay, I'll go see the dog. Her senses were triggered. Her senses got awakened. I touched a dog. She kind of stopped thinking about whatever was upsetting her. So that does work. And obviously pointing them back to Jesus, their identity being in God, encouraging them, praying with them, having that heart-to-heart moment, but really staying open and not quick to just dismiss that. Is that hard, parents? Is that hard, to be with them in that moment when they're upset and you're just like, stop! We have so much to do and get through, right? Or is that hard to then ask questions? Because they know what they need, but we gotta ask them. And then de-escalating the brain, so some flooding strategies. So back to that engaging the senses, mints, weighted items, weighted blankets work, scents, candles, oils, those kind of things are good for that too. Distraction, sometimes you gotta ignore the problem for the moment just to give a little self-regulation. So a little distraction. So with little ones, we do all kinds of things with saying the alphabet backwards, but that can work with a teenager too. Jokes, cracking a joke, trying to get them to move. Draining the emotional tank. So we all walk around with a capacity of what we can handle on the day-to-day in our emotions, right? So if you wake up in the morning and you stub your toe on the bed, and then you realize you're out of coffee, and then you get in your car and you're like, I'm out of gas, and then you get to work and something happens and you're like, really? Can this day go any worse? Already it's 9 o'clock and I haven't lived a full day and I'm already exhausted, right? We've all had that happen to us. Well, the kids have this happen to them too. So the idea is we want to kind of drain that tank before it gets to that overflow. So that can be with freeing that headspace, and that can be breathing, that could be visualization, that could be mindfulness, and I'm careful with the word mindfulness because I know the world has a lot of definitions of what that means, but I mean being still, know that I'm God, bringing God in, really taking those moments to pray and have that meditation on His Word. And then I would say change the channel, and I'm going to talk to them about this, is when we get those thoughts in our head that are not from God. Those thoughts of like, I'm a failure, I can't keep up, I can't do this is too hard. That those thoughts, we can change the channel of our thoughts, and we can rethink that differently. We can reframe that thought. We can say, I may not have mastered this skill just yet, but I'm going to keep trying. And fix, the Bible says, fix your thoughts on what is truth, what is honorable, right, pure, lovely, admirable. Think about these things that are excellent and worthy of praise. So it's really kind of challenging. Well, how could you think about that differently? And I understand that must feel hard to think that way. How could you think about that differently? I'm also going to say brain plate. So if you were to eat a meal's worth of food, like a whole week's worth in one day, you'd be sick, right? So it's the same thing with our thoughts. Like if we're thinking of like a whole week's worth of things we have to do, we're completely overwhelmed. So we might try what's what we call chunking. We just take it one day at a time. So what Jesus tells us to do, right? It's so brilliant. So it's like tell a kid, okay, what do we have on our plate today? What do we need to do today? So we, as teachers in the school system, we love our schedules. We love to have things planned out because that helps break it up. So that's a skill to teach your child, which will also help with their mental health because they learn a strategy. It's a strategy to help them. The box breathing is really easy because we teach them to draw like a box, and each time they draw a line, they're breathing in, then they breathe out, and they breathe in, and they breathe out, and they can do that very discreetly on their leg, on a desk, at home. They can do that anytime, anywhere, and that will just help de-escalate their brain a little bit. But the biggest anecdote to mental health issues is the word resilience, and there's another I will have another video to show, which is about growth mindset, and they all go together. It's this idea of grit and tenacity. And this is what we want to build in our student, this is our child. We want to build this idea of grit and resilience. So let's take a look at this video.
Your mattress shouldn't buckle under pressure. Theirs does. Tempur-Pedic doesn't.
Just yet.
Because Tempur-Pedic mattresses are made of our one-of-a-kind, incredibly adaptive Tempur material for more support and more restorative sleep.
I do not get paid for this.
When I was 27 years old, I left a very demanding job in management consulting for a job that was even more demanding, teaching. I went to teach 7th graders math in the New York City public schools. And like any teacher, I made quizzes and tests, I gave out homework assignments. When the work came back, I calculated grades. What struck me was that IQ was not the only difference between my best and my worst students. Some of my strongest performers did not have stratospheric IQ scores. Some of my smartest kids weren't doing so well. And that got me thinking. The kinds of things you need to learn in 7th grade math, sure, they're hard. Ratios, decimals, the area of a parallelogram. But these concepts are not impossible. And I was firmly convinced that every one of my students could learn the material if they worked hard and long enough. After several more years of teaching, I came to the conclusion that what we need in education is a much better understanding of students and learning from a motivational perspective, from a psychological perspective. In education, the one thing we know how to measure best is IQ. But what if doing well in school and in life depends on much more than your ability to learn quickly and easily? So I left the classroom and I went to graduate school to become a psychologist. I started studying kids and adults in all kinds of super challenging settings. And in every study, my question was, who is successful here and why? My research team and I went to West Point Military Academy. We tried to predict which cadets would stay in military training and which would drop out. We went to the National Spelling Bee and tried to predict which children would advance farthest in competition. We studied rookie teachers working in really tough neighborhoods, asking which teachers are still going to be here in teaching by the end of the school year. And of those, who will be the most effective at improving learning outcomes for their students? We partnered with private companies asking which of these salespeople is going to keep their jobs and who's going to earn the most money. In all those very different contexts, one characteristic emerged as a significant predictor of success. And it wasn't social intelligence, it wasn't good looks, physical health, and it wasn't IQ. It was grit. Grit is passion and perseverance for very long-term goals. Grit is having stamina. Grit is sticking with your future, day in, day out, not just for the week, not just for the month, but for years, and working really hard to make that future a reality. Grit is living life like it's a marathon, not a sprint. A few years ago, I started studying grit in the Chicago public schools. I asked thousands of high school juniors to take grit questionnaires, and then waited around more than a year to see who would graduate. Turns out that grittier kids were significantly more likely to graduate, even when I matched them on every characteristic I could measure. Things like family income, standardized achievement test scores, even how safe kids felt when they were at school. So it's not just at West Point or the National Spelling Bee that grit matters, it's also in school, especially for kids at risk for dropping out. To me, the most shocking thing about grit is how little we know, how little science knows about building it. Every day, parents and teachers ask me, how do I build grit in kids? What do I do to teach kids a solid work ethic? How do I keep them motivated for the long run? The honest answer is, I don't know. What I do know is that talent doesn't make you gritty. Our data show very clearly that there are many talented individuals who simply do not follow through on their commitments. In fact, in our data, grit is usually unrelated or even inversely related to measures of talent. So far, the best idea I've heard about building grit in kids is something called growth mindset. This is an idea developed at Stanford University by Carol Dweck, and it is the belief that the ability to learn is not fixed, that it can change with your effort. Dr. Dweck has shown that when kids read and learn about the brain and how it changes and grows in response to challenge, they're much more likely to persevere when they fail because they don't believe that failure is a permanent condition. So growth mindset is a great idea for building grit, but we need more. And that's where I'm going to end my remarks, because that's where we are. That's the work that stands before us. We need to take our best ideas, our strongest intuitions, and we need to test them. We need to measure whether we've been successful, and we have to be willing to fail, to be wrong, to start over again with lessons learned. In other words, we need to be gritty about getting our kids grittier. Thank you.
Okay, so that term, growth mindset, we can practice that with mental health challenges. And you're like, how do we do that? So the idea is that you are encouraging your child to be able to talk to you by building that connection, and that you're asking lots of questions for them because you want to help them problem solve, right? When they have a problem or when they're confused about something or they're frustrated about something, you want to help them get to a place where they can really think through that and know that they're not stuck. They're not stuck in this current state they're in, that they're constantly growing and moving towards something. And so this is something I'm going to talk to your teens about how you want to focus on growth, right? So if I want to go to the gym and lose some pounds, I'm not going to be so fixated on the number. I need to be focused on the fact that I'm showing up every day, or that I'm doing my best, and that's it. I'm proud of myself for showing up. And that's what we want to teach them, is that we're proud of them for showing up and not giving up. It's not so much the end result. It's not the A, it's not the college acceptance. It's, are you a good person? Are you working on being a good friend? Are you kind? Is it your character? Are you doing your best? So also building connections, and I see you guys have a beautiful support system here. Building connections, building relationships with friends that are good for them, and being part of the church, that's important. That helps build resilience, because then it gives them that support network, because we're not built on an island, right? We need to have support, we need each other. Setting boundaries, and boundaries are really important because they need to know that, we as parents love them, and therefore we set these loving boundaries. And I kind of wanted to say I'll give you an example, like this is not a boundary. So when I say don't be out past curfew, that's not a boundary, but a boundary could look like your curfew is 10 o'clock. If you do not come back by 10 o'clock, you won't be allowed out again without an adult. I gave a very clear instruction of what my expectation was. I gave a very clear what happens when you don't meet what I'm telling you to do, and then I have to hold to it, right? That's then the tricky part. We really want them to feel like these boundaries are postures of love, and that we're coming from it just the way God does. He tells us certain things we have to abide by, and we don't, there's consequences for that, right? Having them be flexible and open to change, and that part of that is some kids we know are more rigid than others. That's just kind of their personality, so we're just kind of taking it as it comes and kind of showing our flexibility. Okay, well, what do you think we could do? It didn't go our way today. What can we do? Ask lots of questions and be curious, and just teaching them to be perseverant. And those are really good anecdotes for supporting them in their mental health, right? Is making them strong. I can tell you how many times I get parents that want to change students' classes, and sometimes it's a silly request, it seems, right? And you're like, oh, it's just a silly request. I'm like, but if I can't change it, and this is where they are, I want to encourage them to make the most of it. And maybe there's a lesson here, and that's okay too, because that's a life lesson. We don't always get what we want, and sometimes we don't get anything we want, and then we just have to roll with it and find the good in it, right? So I'll leave you with boundaries to resilience. So kind of like a summary of what we kind of talked about. What's the next slide? But kind of connection before correction. So make sure you're connecting with them before you jump into, well, you didn't do this and you didn't do your homework and blah, 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 blah. Before you confront the issue, find connection with them. Hey, I noticed today you were a little quiet. How's it going? Everything good? Tell me about your friend. You were talking to little Johnny over there. How'd that go tonight? Who'd you hang out with tonight? How was that? And because sometimes that confrontation right away, you're gonna get opposition, right? They're just gonna, they're already at me, they're starting, they shut down. We don't want that, we want the connection. And of course, rules without relationship equals rebellion. I think it was Bob Barnes who said that. So he's very wise, right? So we want to have the boundaries, because I like that word more than these strict rules, more of like a boundaries, the guidance, but with a lot of love and flexibility, because we want to talk to them about that. Why do I have this in place? Because it's to protect you. It's because I want you to learn this. It's because we're doing this together. Encourage that growth mindset. So the word yet is really, really important, because you can say, hey, you haven't mastered that yet. Or yeah, maybe you haven't figured that out yet, but you will. And really encouraging that sense of like, I'm working towards something. I'm working on the progress. And skills that they're missing. So this was like back to that idea of like, they might be missing a skill. So if we're asking them to meet something and they're not getting there, maybe it's because they're missing the skill to do that. And there was an example of like a little girl, on a basketball team, and if the coach yelled at her and said, you didn't make that layup, go to your room until you figure out how to make the layup, we'd think the coach was crazy. We'd be like, okay, you didn't even teach her, you didn't stop to show her. How's she gonna learn by going to her room? This is the same thing. So when they're having a moment, now we do need breaks. So if they're escalated, we know we can't reason. So we may have that break, that engaging senses, and later come back to that conversation and say, how could we have handled that differently? I didn't like how that went. How can we handle that a little bit differently? When I'm feeling a little frustrated, I might say, you know what? I'm feeling a little frustrated right now. I'm gonna go take some deep breaths and I'm gonna come back to this conversation. We can model that for them, because then they know have the skill of how to do that. That's what we wanted to really figure out. And also, this is like a crash course in a few things, but if you do need help, if you feel like there's something going on, don't be ashamed to seek mental health help. What I find, this generation, they're so open to it, and that's one of the best things about social media, is they're very open to getting help, and it's almost like very normal to go to counseling. So that's kind of good. So we have that going for us. And I'm going to leave them with this quote too, because I love this. We're enough, they are enough. This is from Focus on the Family. When the internal and external voices whisper the lies, you're insignificant, you're not enough, and you don't measure up. We want our children to know deep in their souls, the only one who gets to define them is the one who created them and calls them beloved. We want to point them back to Jesus. Their identity's in Him. He says they're worthy, and we need to remember that too, and that He's got this. He's got their journey all figured out, even though we're figuring out alongside with Him. He's got it, so we got to trust that. And then I had some counseling referrals up here, so I got cut off a little bit, but these are some great resources for you if you feel you need to get out in the community. And I thank you, and I'll just open it up to any questions or comments. No questions?
This is the Q&A time, guys, before the kids come down, so.
So there's always an expectation, I think, with adults and even in this generation, when we see the fast track and on social media of people who are successful, and oftentimes they're younger people that are successful. I think the highest grossing YouTuber is child, right? I'm not the parent of that child, but I think one thing is, how do we speak to a child who is saying, that feels that pressure that they have to achieve, and they spoke a little bit of that on the Social Dilemma, the video, right?
Right.
But the child who has an ability, a talent, whatever, or an idea, and it just the road is long, and it feels like someone has bypassed a lot of those steps on social media to be able to get there, and you have this child who is just.
They're frustrated.
They're
frustrated. So we're gonna first acknowledge that they feel frustrated,
right.
and oh yeah, that is kind of frustrating, isn't it? It just seems like this person just walked right in and they're famous, right? And they got all these likes, but you know what? God has a different plan for you, and I wonder what skills you have that this person may not, and what path and journey the Lord might have for you, and how can we get there together? You know, where's there some things we can do right now to help you in those goals? And then maybe limiting that social media a little bit, right? So that idea of fear of missing out, which they call FOMO, is very real. I mean, these poor kids subconsciously are comparing themselves every day to what they see. You know, for our generation, it was magazines, you know, we saw the beautiful models with the magazines. Now it's these filters, you know, these people are, you know, totally altered. And so these kids are hearing these messages day in and day out that they're not enough. So we really got to remind them they're not. And I think another anecdote to that is being in the community and having relationships with real live people and not the virtual world. But I definitely think acknowledging where they feel is important, because the only way out is through, and we want to acknowledge feelings. We're not afraid of feelings. Feelings aren't facts. We just don't give in to feelings. Feelings are things that we acknowledge, but then we come a plan to move through them. We're not just anytime we feel something, act on it, because that would be crazy, right? So, but thank you. That's a good question. Anyone else?
Natalie, can you share, because I know you share with the teenagers, and then you ask your teenager, hey, what'd you learn? They'll be like, I don't know. So the self-care, I know you've shared that with students, and I think that's great. Can you share some of those things?
So thinking about like how they can self-care for themselves. So I've actually read a lot of literature too about neurobiology and our chemistry. So when we wake up in the morning, I love to tell them this, because when we wake up, we actually benefit from getting some sunlight through our eyes and on our body. Like, it helps with the vitamin D, it helps lower cortisol level, it actually increases melatonin for the evening time. So there's this, you know, like God in his infinite wisdom, like we're supposed to be outside, like we were made for this Garden of Eden. So a lot of times I talk to them about like just going outside and like being in nature, going for walks. Who can they talk to? You know, instead of trying to numb themselves with a video game or on the social media when they're feeling something, call a friend, talk to your parent, do some journaling, eat regularly. You know, how many times sometimes kids will say to me, oh yeah, I have a headache. I'm like, oh, did you have breakfast today? And they're like, no, I had a donut at 11 and it's like 2 o'clock. And I'm like, no, that's not taking care of yourself. So there's just these strategies of just like, it's basic self-care, but it affects our neurobiology and how we feel. It affects the chemicals in our brain. So it's very powerful. Don't underestimate good night's sleep, good food. Like I tell them that, don't underestimate those tools. We need them. You know, we just think we can just go. We're not robots. Alba?
Can you talk about, oh, I love that you know my name, you get a donut. Can you talk about how to work on not like reducing the busyness of our mind parents and helping our children reduce the busyness of their mind because
Yeah.
of all that.
Yeah, because there's a lot coming in, right? So we have, and we do it. Like there's so many thoughts that plague us on a day-to-day basis. So that's where that visualization and mindfulness strategy and breathing is really helpful. It's the idea of emptying our minds of those things and refocusing on something else. So in a lot of times when I meet with a child, I will teach them how to do their own visualization exercise. A lot of times they pick the safe place as their room, which is pretty interesting. And so we walk through what the room looks like, what it smells like, what it feels like, where are they sitting? Are they on their bed? Are they on their desk chair? You know, who are they thinking about? What are they doing? And so it all helps calm that brain a little bit, and then they're able to kind of process better. I love journaling for that reason too, because they've studied, and I think that's also fascinating, when you write something down as opposed to typing it, it actually comes out and you feel better. So like the to-do list, when you're like in the middle of the night, they say, hey, if you wake up and you think of something, write it down and then you can go back to sleep. There's actually like data to prove that that's true. So that helps them get it out too. Exercise, also very powerful antidepressant, by the way. So,
those are things that you do share, like the journal.
yes.
Because I mentioned it also to my kids,
And they won't hear it from you, right? They won't hear that from you? Yeah. Sounds about right too.
This is more of a comment than a question, but I find a lot of times that parents aren't as willing to take their kids to counseling, which is very normal nowadays, right? Because it kind of puts them in a position where they kind of have to face their own things too, because sometimes counseling is a whole family thing. It's not just,
That's a good point.
It's not an isolated, silo where it's just a kid,
Yeah.
fix them. It goes back to the parents, and I would encourage, everyone that if you have a child who does need therapy and stuff, get involved in that and be open to going yourself, because we're,
Absolutely. I think that's
we're all in need, right?
Absolutely. And nothing really gives us that perspective as to having children and realizing we have stuff that we brought with us to our marriages, to our children, and we're like, oh, it's there. We have to deal with it. And so I think also there's strength in that, because then you're showing your child, like, you're human. We're human, we're works in progress. We're not made for this destination of like, hey, I've arrived. Like, we're always working towards progress. And that's where we want to celebrate that journey. That's part of growth mindset.
So you mentioned Bob Barnes, and there's a lot of books out there. Are there any books that you recommend parents to read to help them guide through this new process of raising children?
Sure, so I love all of his books. Love Bob Barnes dearly, so any of his books. I also like Allison Edwards. She wrote a book called Flooded, and she also has a lot of books for teens and for elementary students. So Allison Edwards is her name. It's on Amazon. So. Bob Barnes, Strong-Willed Child. Love and Logic is also another program you could purchase online. It's like a virtual webinar class, and it talks a lot about boundaries, creating boundaries for your children in a loving way. It's not punitive. It's meant to encourage connection and relationship, because isn't that what God wants of us, like relationship with Him? And that's where the change comes from. The change in us comes from our love from God and Him slowly stirring in us. So that's what we want with our kids. We want to have good connection and relationship. And we have boundaries out of love. Yes, there's consequences, because there are consequences, but it's all out of love. So Love and Logic is another good one. Yes, because you can always have redemption in a relationship. We believe that we serve a God that we can redeem. So if it's like, hey, you know what, in the past, it really came down on you really hard, I'm going to try some new things. There's still going to be consequences. You could lose your phone, you could lose privileges, but I want to do this out of love, and we want to have some more conversations about this. I don't think there's anything wrong with changing. You saw it in yourself.
But I just wanted to have to see me as human being.
Yes.
And I'm like, I was just exactly like I did that before when I was younger. And you know what I did? I did this and that helped me change a little bit. So that's great. I mean, that means you are my son.
What was his reaction to that?
And he's like, he felt like compassion. He felt like I care for him and that I understood him.
Absolutely, you empathized with him.
Exactly.
You disarmed him because instead of creating opposition, you created a bridge of connection. Yeah, and I would even say like, because I could say something like that to my child about, you know, things that we have, and it could be like, you know, but I'm still working on it too, and I can work with you together. How do you think we can do that? You know, what's something we could work on, you know?
Just a comment. I've been trying to find things that I can do to put together, like Bible studies or whatever we can find so that we can communicate on that level. We just finished doing a Bible study on anxiety. So it gives you God's word and how you can store that in your heart. And then we get to do it together. There were videos that we could do together. If you have any suggestions on things like that, you know, we can do as a family.
As a family. There's a lot of workbooks out there, and I think, you know, Amazon search will give you plenty of stuff. I'm wondering if something that, what does she enjoy doing? What is something she's excited about or passionate about? Art. Okay, so perfect. My daughter loves art too, actually, one of my oldest ones. I don't, not so much, because I'm not an artist, but one way could be, hey, you know what? I was thinking I'd really love to do an art project with you. Can you come up with something we could do together? And maybe allow her to show some artistic expression and create something for you guys to do together as a family. And I know you're talking about like Bible study and that kind of thing, but I'm saying connect with her on that passion she loves, because that's going to open a whole new world for her to want to talk to you about. And let her talk about it. Like, you may not even be interested. Oh, wow, that's amazing. I never knew that. Go with it. You know, because that will definitely bridge that connection. My mom takes care and interest in what I'm interested in. Goes a long way, guys. Really, like, there was another, I follow all these different doctors, right? But they're like 5 minutes of just doing one small thing with your child of just connection building goes a huge way, because you fill their love tank and you just kind of help them feel validated and seen. So, any other questions? Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Let's give her a hand. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Natalie. You were great. You know, wasn't she great, guys?